Hello and welcome to this talk on extremism, identity fusion, and video games. I am Dr. Rachel Kowert. I am a research psychologist. I'm also the research director for Take This, which is a mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming industry and gaming communities. Today I'm going to be giving a brief talk about extremism, identity fusion, and video games. There is a growing concern that gaming spaces are particularly vulnerable to online radicalization, and this talk is going to provide a broad overview of what we know about the state of radicalization in games and discuss identity and community mechanisms that are actively being leveraged by extremists in gaming spaces for the dissemination of propaganda, radicalization, and recruitment. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my more recent work with identity fusion. Before we get started, I want to give a little bit more of an introduction to Take This. As I said, we are a mental health nonprofit. We serve the gaming industry and gaming communities, and we aim to destigmatize mental health challenges and provide mental health information and support. You can learn more about our work at Take This at takethis.org. So the internet has a history of being a gateway to communities devoted to extremist movements and spaces. These online platforms include forums, social media, YouTube, but over the last few years, there's been growing concern specifically about extremism in games. People are concerned about extremists using the extensive reach of games and gaming spaces for recruitment, propaganda dissemination, signaling, networking, and mobilization. We see this concern from this 2021 article featured in Wired, that's where that image comes from, but also organizations like the Department of Homeland Security, the UN Office of Counterterrorism, both of whom have had specifically focused workshops in the last couple years about extremism in games. As it stands today, what we mostly know about extremism in games is that it exists, it is present in gaming and gaming adjacent spaces. In 2021, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue put out a report looking at the extreme right specifically, focusing on game-adjacent platforms, focusing on Discord, which is a third-party platform, a chat server that gaming communities often use. They found that it serves as a hub for right-wing socializing and community building. They also specifically noted that gaming was referenced in cultural terms and being used by members of right-wing servers to find a common ground. The ISD report also reported the presence of white supremacist worldviews on Twitch, which is a live streaming platform which is largely centered on gaming content, though not exclusively, through the broadcasting of content that promotes white supremacist worldviews, and that this kind of content can be found with, quote, relative ease. So this includes creating content on Twitch that supports extreme ideologies, for example, playing a popular game while sharing such ideologies, as well as using the platform to troll and spew hate and racism towards others. Now, these two examples, Discord and Twitch, these are gaming adjacent spaces, but what do we know about the presence of extremist behavior within games themselves? 2019, the Anti-Defamation League published a report that said that 1 in 4, 23% of game players, are exposed to white supremacist ideology in-game. In 2021, this number was closer to 1 in 10, but it's unclear if these disparities are due to differences in sampling or actual changes in the landscape. It's also reported in this ADL report that players experience exposure to the most explicit forms of white supremacist ideologies across platforms: PC, console, and mobile. So it's not limited to just one. Going back to the ISD report, Steam, which is an online platform where you can buy, sell, and create games, has also been found to house a range of servers created for the far-right and neo-Nazi groups. And there are also games created specifically for the propagation of extremist ideology. There are many examples. This is just one. It's called Hatred. It is a mass shooter genocide crusade simulation made for the PC and available for Steam. A lot of groups also modify over-the-counter games to reflect extremist worldviews. For example, making Hitler-led Nazi Germany a playable nation in a modded version of the Civilization series. Then, of course, there's pre-existing gaming spaces that have been customized by extremist groups. There are an innumerable amount of these kinds of custom spaces within gaming platforms. Here's an example from Roblox, where someone has created a custom space based off a Nazi concentration camp. It's meant to look and act like a Nazi concentration camp. Jacob Davey of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue said to the BBC when talking about these kinds of customized spaces that extremists are creating role-playing experiences to live out their radicalized fantasies online. And for me, this quote really highlights the interactive nature of games themselves and how they're being leveraged not just for messaging, but for extremist behaviors. So in this instance, he was talking about a concentration-style camp created in Minecraft. And I do want to note these last two examples came from Roblox and Minecraft, and it's not that these kind of situations are more prevalent in these gamings specifically, but Minecraft and Roblox are both more accessible for research purposes. So these kinds of customizable spaces certainly exist in any space that is customizable, like in the example I gave about modding Civilization, for example. So taking this all together, we see there's ample evidence to indicate that extremist ideology, propaganda, and potentially recruitment exists in gaming and gaming adjacent spaces. It is there, it is present. However, when discussing the landscape of extremism in games, we're not just interested in its presence, we're also interested in how games are being specifically leveraged for extremist purposes as social, playful, interactive spaces. We have largely failed to recognize in our discussion of the presence of extremism in games that games are uniquely poised within the internet space in a way that makes them potentially more vulnerable to the propagation of extremist ideology than other spaces on the internet. In fact, of all the talks I've given over the last couple years where these topics are discussed, I can't really remember a single talk where the uniqueness of games was taken into account, unless it was me talking. So let's discuss just that. We're going to talk about 3 potential vulnerabilities of gaming spaces. And I think it's really important to think about these vulnerabilities, to consider them when we're trying to understand the scope and nature of extremist behavior and how to best implement and develop solutions. So the first thing we need to consider is the social environment of games. So gaming spaces are categorized as havens for marginalized, disaffected youth. And while demographic reports paint a more diverse picture of gaming communities, many individuals do turn to gaming spaces to find a sense of social community. Now, social community can be found on many different spaces on the internet, but the social bonds made on games are different. Friendships between co-players tend to be close, intimate, and long-lasting, which is unlike the loose ties that are generally described as characteristic of friendships made online. Research reports between 40 and 70% of game players regularly discuss offline issues with their online friends, including concerns they have not yet discussed with their offline friends, suggesting that these online relationships made through games are primary sources of social and emotional support. They're close, tight-knit friendship bonds. Now, games have the ability to foster these close bonds because of the shared experiences of the games themselves. Essentially, friendships are emotionally jump-started and friendships are formed backwards. So trust is formed in the beginning and then you slowly get to know someone later versus slowly getting to know someone and having trust established over time. Did you stand in the AOE, the big purpley bubble stuff on the ground? Yes, I probably can't trust you. Did you move away from the stuff that's hurting you on the ground? Awesome, I can trust you and now I'll get to know you. So research has found that one's community is often more important to the player than the games they play together. And we see this time and again in research with MMORPGs, World of Warcraft, for example. When you ask people why they continue to play over time, it's not because of the content of the game itself. It's not because it's particularly cutting edge. It's because of the social community and the bonds they formed in these spaces. Another thing to note is the social and emotional impact of these friendships between co-players very rarely lives exclusively in online contexts, which I think is often a misconception. A 2021 study commissioned by Roblox and done in conjunction with InternetMatters.org and Youth Site found that, quote, online friendships enhance feelings of belonging driven by trust, that players feel a deeper sense of belonging and more accepted by their online community than they are offline. This is just one study of many that have found a similar conclusion. Now, as I discuss the social environment of games, the emotionally jump-started relationship building, the foundational level of trust, the social reinforcement of engagement within these spaces, this specific combination, this specific cocktail of social qualities is unique to games as compared to other spaces on the internet. and they're also key components to successful radicalization. So let me illustrate this with an example. This is taken from that 2021 Wired article. It says, quote, "Here's one version of how far-right recruitment is supposed to work. Bobby queues up for a Fortnite match and gets paired with big bad skinhead Ryland. Ryland has between 2 and 20 minutes to make his pitch to Bobby over voice chat before enemy player Sally shotguns them both in the face. If Ryland's vibe is intriguing, maybe Bobby accepts his Fortnite friend request and they catch some more games and continue their friendship over Discord. Over time, weeks or months, Ryland normalizes extremist ideology for Bobby, and eventually the kid becomes radicalized." Now we see how the social environment can be leveraged to, in this example, Ryland's advantage. Ryland shows his prowess in a Fortnite match. Ryland and Bobby work together. Ryland probably doesn't stand in the AoE and trust is established. And after a few matches, Ryland says, "Hey Bobby, I got some other cool friends for you to meet over here in this Discord server." And then Bobby starts engaging in a social community of other people who share Ryland's point of view. Bobby has an initial level of trust with Ryland, right? Because he trusts him because of the experiences they've had in Fortnite. He starts to develop a sense of belonging. They continue to engage together, and, quote, "eventually the kid becomes radicalized." Now, this is just one way in which radicalization can occur. But there is a unique social dynamic that games can offer. The shared, stressful, exciting, trust-building social experiences structure the social environment and guide interpersonal interactions. They set a foundation of trust between co-players that happens much faster and creates a much more tight-knit bond and community than other spaces on the internet. And that is a potential vulnerability when it comes to radicalization and recruitment. The second vulnerability is the process of othering. So othering is a key process in identity building. It is the classic us versus them. It is the process of stigmatizing those who do not share similar ideas and values that we do, and therefore identifying them as someone who does not belong in the community. So if someone experiences marginalization in their daily lives and they lack a sense of belonging, they may be persuaded to look for an alternative community that they can identify with, and online gaming cultures are particularly well suited to fill this need, as they're easily accessible, again, thought to be populated by other marginalized people seeking social community and validation. These us versus them group dynamics solidify friendships and are particularly entrenched in gamer cultures. And we see this every few months when the "you aren't a real gamer if you don't play on hard mode" starts making its rounds around Twitter. Or when we consider the entire concept of a girl gamer. The us, the hardcore gamer, and the them, the everyone else. Now, this is not necessarily unique to the social group of gamers. However, when considered in the context of close social relationships that form between co-players, the othering processes hold the potential to be more strongly adopted by one's social community, solidifying their ties to the group of gamers to the exclusion of anyone else who doesn't fit the mold, the others. The content of games themselves can also contribute to othering processes. For example, realistic war games have powerful biases in the depiction of the enemy, typically, and when games reflect an ethnocentric view of the world, they marginalize those who do not share the same fundamental beliefs and enhance this idea of us versus them. We see this in many off-the-shelf titles, but also the extreme example I gave earlier of the game Hatred. You know, the primary mechanic of this game, of Hatred and other games like it, is this idea of othering. Now, this is not me saying games shouldn't have an us versus them dynamic, but rather pointing out that these dynamics can further reinforce ethnocentric ideas and be used to further leverage games as spaces for the propagation of extremist ideas and belief systems. Lastly, I want to talk about cultures and identity, not only because this underpins the social environment and othering processes I just discussed, but also there's really a lot to unpack when it comes to gamer cultures and identities, and discussions about them are really at the center of why there is such a great concern about games as incubators for extremist ideologies. Video game cultures, gamer identities, really started developing in the late 1970s for those who participated in the very strange activity of playing video games in dimly lit arcades. The term gamer was devised to define and unite a group of predominantly white male players, and also differentiating them from other subcultural movements, us versus them. Now notice I'm saying the word gamer and gamer cultures. This isn't about people who just play games. My mom is a player. She plays Wordle every day. She would never call herself a gamer. This is about the social identity of a gamer and all of that entails. So a player is a temporary functional status. A gamer is a concept that comprises long-term aspects of self-construction, self-perception, individual, societal, and cultural positioning. The social identity that one adopts not only identifies yourself as a member of a group, but also positions you in relation to the rest of the world. Now, we have a lot of social identities. I am a cisgender female. I am a Witcher enthusiast. If you know, you know. I am a gamer, right? All these identities are important, and they allow us to position ourselves in the world. They inform our self-perception. They embed us in our social networks and our groups. Gamer identities specifically have been linked to a range of psychological and behavioral outcomes. Increased playtime, right? Because going back to the social reinforcement of games. Reduce loneliness. You have a sense of belonging. You're a sense of a gaming community. And even increased life satisfaction because our social groups can give our lives more meaning. However, there's a caveat when it comes to gamer cultures and gamer identities, and that is that they are generally seen and generally are toxic and more associated with exclusion than inclusion. As noted by game designer Brianna Wu in a Washington Post op-ed, the quote is, "The gaming world is thronged by misogynists and racists who feel free to advocate harm against anyone who's not like them." This is just one short clip from quite a long quote, but I think it really gets at this idea of what's often dubbed toxic gamer culture. Cultures of misogyny, racism, and toxicity has created spaces where hate and harassment are normalized. And let's not kid ourselves, they have become normalized in gamer cultures. This chart comes from a 2021 paper looking at the more extreme forms of toxic deviant behavior. It's called dark participation in this paper. And we see the rate at which extreme forms of these behaviors are experienced in blue and witnessed in orange. We have sexual harassment, hate speech, and violent threats in games specifically. And as we can see here, they are the norm, not the exception. But what does toxic gamer culture have to do with extremism specifically? Well, we know that when we allow hate to spread without consequence, it normalizes hate in all spaces. Normalization in the digital space can and has led to normalization of hate in non-digital spaces. We've seen this in the past, specifically in relation to the normalization of hate in gamer cultures with events like Gamergate in 2014, where online hate transcended into offline violent behavior, including death threats. There's also evidence that hate and harassment in gaming spaces can translate to extremist behavior. Specifically, first, research has pointed out that participation in these kinds of toxic behaviors online is associated with an increased risk at being persuaded by far-right extremist propaganda specifically. Being entrenched in a culture that normalizes hate increases the likelihood that you too may choose to participate in that behavior. And participation can lead you more vulnerable to more extreme forms of behavior, both in and out of gaming spaces. And I know, we know from years of psychological research that the nature of our social environment impacts the way we see and interact with the world. And we also know that many perpetrators of real-world violence are radicalized online first. We also see a normalization of extremist language in games. A new report published by the ADL in conjunction with Take This, the Middlebury Institute, and Gamer Safer found evidence for the normalization of hateful and extremist language in gaming spaces, in Minecraft specifically in this work. Looking at more than 1.4 million chat logs across Minecraft servers, evidence was found for the normalization of hateful language. Specifically, the presence of slurs that were previously only associated with extreme white nationalist groups were found to be used just as everyday jargon in these gaming spaces. Interestingly, in this report, we also found that hateful messages were 21% more likely to be shared in public chats than private chats, whereas sexualized language was more likely to be shared in private chat than public chat. Again, pointing to this idea that hateful speech, is being normalized, accepted, and embedded in gamer cultures. Now, as I open the talk today, perhaps some of these things aren't shocking, although I feel it's quite compelling in a sense that gamer cultures are a thing. But I want to end with some new research that really illustrates why toxic gamer cultures are important beyond the scope of games themselves. I've been doing some work in identity fusion, which further reiterates these points over the last year, in collaboration with the University of Texas, Alexi Martel and Bill Swan specifically, looking at this concept called identity fusion in the context of gamer identities. Now, typically we have our personal identity, the I am, and our social identities, the we are, and these identities are separate. But sometimes individual and social identities fuse together, and the borders between the two become more porous. And this is called identity fusion. Fusion is interesting because when fusion happens, an individual is more willing to enlist the personal self in service of the group. They're more willing to make personal sacrifices for group goals. Now, typically, fusion happens when people feel a deep emotional bond to their social group that forms over time through a series of shared experiences, shared norms, close, tight-knit friendship bonds. Typically, fusion has focused on groups like nationalist groups or military groups. My dad was a Marine. If you know Marine, once a Marine, always Marine. That's like the most perfect example of a fused identity. Now, these contributors to fusion, shared experiences, shared norms, close, tight-knit friendship bonds, are also characteristics and experiences central to gaming groups and gaming communities. So we looked at identity fusion and the concept of gamer identities, and what we found is not only that fusion exists with gamer cultures, but that fusion with gamer cultures reflects the toxic nature of these cultures. Specifically, identity fusion with gamer cultures was associated with the willingness to fight or die for other gamers. This is the element of self-sacrifice for the betterment of the group, extreme pro-group behavior, recent aggressive behaviors, Machiavellianism, which is a personality trait characterized by being deceitful and lacking morality, manipulation of others, narcissism, psychopathy, a lack of empathy, sexism, racism, and here it says alt-right identity, but what it should say is white nationalism. It relates specifically to endorsing beliefs associated with policies and ideas around white nationalism. Notably, it was associated with identity with white nationalism, but not right-wing conservative political identity, which I thought was a particularly interesting finding. What's also interesting to note here is that age, gender, and years gaming had no effect on these outcomes, but gameplay time did. Excuse me. Excuse me. So these relationships were found to be significantly stronger with those who played more multiplayer online games as compared to single-player offline games, suggesting that the playtime isn't about exposure to gaming content, but gaming cultures. That is, the more immersed you are in the cultures, the greater likelihood you are to be exposed to extreme ideologies, the more opportunity you have to internalize these beliefs and endorse more extreme behavior. Excuse me. Just getting over perhaps COVID, maybe a flu, something. Racism, willingness to fight and die for the group. Now, linking back to the discussion from earlier, these effects were more prevalent and more magnified in more toxic spaces with violent content than less competitive, less violent, or cooperative spaces. So we also looked at fusion with extreme outcomes among Call of Duty players versus Minecraft players. And we found that players in the different gaming communities had similar levels of antisocial and pro-social sentiments. The averages across players of these two groups were the same. But when you looked at the impact of fusion with gaming, it predicted greater social toxicity and greater social positivity, depending on the gaming environment. TLDR, negative outcomes were found among Call of Duty players. It reflected a personality profile similar to the one I just showed you, or is more pro-social among Minecraft players. So we think this is reflective of the toxic environment, could also be reflective of the competitive nature of the game, or both. Oh, excuse me, I should have had water here. Pardon me. So taking this all together, we can conclude that digital games are performing a socializing function in the wider context of radicalization as cultural assets of influence. They're being leveraged to normalize, desensitize, and mobilize. Extremist actors are recruiting, signaling fundraising, disseminating propaganda in gaming spaces, and it's happening everywhere across platforms, age, and gender. To move forward, we need to work together as a group of stakeholders, developers, platforms, government agencies, researchers, players themselves. We all have a role in this process through collaboration, data sharing, funding, training, and capacity building. And I think that having these conversations in a public way is a great first step to actually support this collaboration, because we're generally limited in our ability to respond if we aren't talking about these things. So thank you for coming to this talk today. And if you have any questions about this work, please feel free to reach out via email or Twitter. Thank you.